At 2 years old, most children are only beginning to understand the world around them. They are learning words, recognizing faces, reaching for toys, laughing, crying, stumbling through the first memories of childhood. But one little boy in Tibet was about to be pulled into something far bigger than childhood. Because one day, a group of monks arrived at his home with an extraordinary belief. They believed this child was the Dalai Lama. Not that he would become important one day, not that he was gifted, not that he had a bright future ahead of him. They believed he was already the reincarnation of one of the most important spiritual leaders in the world, and now they had to prove it. This is the unbelievable true story of the boy who was chosen as the Dalai Lama at just 2 years old. Before the world knew him as the 14th Dalai Lama, he was a child named Lhamo Thondup. He was born into a simple farming family in a small village in Tibet. There was nothing royal about his life. No palace, no throne, no army of servants, no grand signs that the world was about to change around him. He was just a little boy. And that is what makes this story so powerful. Because history usually introduces great figures at the moment they rise. But this story begins long before power. It begins with innocence. It begins with a child. To understand why monks would travel across Tibet looking for one specific boy, you first have to understand what the Dalai Lama means in Tibetan Buddhism. The Dalai Lama is not seen as an ordinary leader who is simply replaced when he dies. He is believed to return, again and again, generation after generation. When one Dalai Lama dies, the search begins for the next child believed to be his reincarnation. This is not treated as a metaphor. It is treated as a sacred mission, a search guided by tradition, signs, visions, intuition, and ritual. So when the 13th Dalai Lama died, the search began. Somewhere, the monks believed, the next Dalai Lama had already been born. Somewhere, there was a child carrying the continuation of that spiritual legacy into a new life. Search parties went out across Tibet, following clues and signs, and eventually, that search led them to a remote village, to a simple home, to a little boy named Lhamo Thondup. Try to imagine that moment. One day, your child is simply your child. The next day, strangers arrive and begin looking at him differently. Not as a village boy, not as a farmer's son, but as someone sacred, someone chosen, someone who may belong not just to his family anymore, but to history. That alone is enough to sound unbelievable. But what came next is the part that makes this story unforgettable. Because the monks did not just look at him and make a declaration, they tested him. According to Tibetan tradition, the child was shown a number of objects. Some had belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. Others were merely similar-looking objects placed there as decoys. The question was simple. Would the child recognize the real ones? Would he choose the correct items? Would he show signs that he was not an ordinary boy, but the true reincarnation they had been searching for? Think about the tension of that moment. A room full of adults, serious faces, silence hanging in the air, a toddler sitting in the center of it all. He is too young to understand the stakes, too young to understand why everyone is watching him, too young to know that what he does next could change the entire course of his life. And yet, every glance matters, every movement matters, every choice matters. Because if he reaches for the correct objects, then to the people in that room, it means something enormous. It means this may be the child they have crossed mountains and villages to find. It means this may be the next Dalai Lama. And that is what makes the moment feel almost cinematic. A small child, a handful of objects, a room full of expectation, a future hanging on what tiny hands do next. According to the accounts that followed, the boy did recognize the correct items. And when that happened, everything changed. The monks became convinced. They believed they had found him. Not a symbolic replacement, not a clever choice, not a future candidate. The child who, in their eyes, was the reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama. The boy who would become the 14th Dalai Lama. And this is where the story stops being only mysterious and starts becoming deeply emotional. Because we love stories about destiny. We love stories about greatness. We love stories about people being chosen for something extraordinary. But we rarely stop and ask the harder question. What does being chosen cost? Because this was not simply an honor. It was not just praise. It was not just admiration. It was the end of an ordinary childhood. One moment, he was a boy in a village. The next, he was expected to carry a spiritual identity far bigger than himself. His life no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to tradition. It belonged to faith. It belonged to the expectations of millions. That is an incredible thing to place on anyone. But on a child? That is what gives this story its emotional force. Before he was old enough to understand freedom, his future had already been decided. Before he could choose who he wanted to become, the world had chosen for him. That is beautiful and heartbreaking. And maybe that is why this story continues to fascinate people all over the world. Because no matter what your beliefs are, the image is unforgettable. A child in a small room, monks watching closely, objects laid out before him, a life about to split into two parts, before he was recognized, and after. As he grew older, the child once known as Lhamo Thondup became Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama. He would go on to become one of the most recognized spiritual leaders in the world, a symbol of compassion, a voice for peace, a figure associated with wisdom, nonviolence, and inner discipline. But the global figure people know today began as a little boy in a remote village. That contrast is what makes the story unforgettable. The man known across the world began as a toddler, being watched in silence by monks who believed he carried the soul of the Dalai Lama. Most world figures are introduced to history when they are already powerful. The Dalai Lama's story begins before power, before authority, before choice. It begins with innocence. And maybe that is the deepest part of all. Because this is not just a story about religion. It is not just a story about Tibet. It is not just a story about spiritual tradition. It is a story about what happens when destiny arrives too early. It is a story about a child being pulled out of ordinary life and placed inside something immense. It is a story about identity, belief, sacrifice, and the strange weight of being chosen. Some people hear this story and see a miracle. Others hear it and see an ancient ritual rooted in faith and centuries of tradition. Some are drawn to its spiritual meaning. Others are captivated by the emotional reality of it. But almost everyone reacts the same way at first. Wait, he was only 2 years old? And that is why this story lasts. Because it feels impossible. Because it sounds like legend. And yet, for millions of people, it was real. In the end, the most haunting part of this story is not simply that a child was chosen. It is that the choice came with both honor and loss. To be seen as extraordinary by the world is one thing. To lose your ordinary life because of it is something else. And that is why the story of the Dalai Lama continues to resonate so deeply. Because beneath the history, beneath the spirituality, beneath the mystery, there is something universal. A question. If the world told you, before you were old enough to understand it, that your life belonged to something bigger than yourself, would that be a gift or a sacrifice? That is the story of the boy who was chosen as the Dalai Lama at 2 years old. And that is why the world still cannot look away.